From being arrested for voting, to going to prison for wearing pants, to being burned alive just for knowing too much about herbs. This is the full, unbelievable history of when simply being a woman was enough to get you locked up, fined, or killed. And spoiler, some of these laws weren't from ancient history. Some were still on the books last Tuesday. Okay, not last Tuesday, but closer than you think. Let's start at the very beginning. Ancient world, where it all began. We're talking 1750 BC, ancient Babylon, and already women had their own dedicated section in the law books. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest written legal codes in history, laid out exactly what women were and weren't allowed to do. And the list of weren'ts was long. If a woman tried to run her own business without her husband's permission, crime. If she was found guilty of adultery, death. If her husband was found guilty of the same thing, he just had to swear an oath and move on with his life. Completely fine. That's not a typo. In Middle Assyria, a civilization that existed around 1400 BC, the laws got even wilder. Women were required to be veiled in public. That sounds familiar, right? But here's the twist. It was slave women and prostitutes who were forbidden from wearing veils, because the veil was considered a marker of respectability. So it wasn't about covering up. It was about labeling. Cover your face and you're respectable. Show your face and you're branded as lesser. Either way, your face was being controlled by someone else's law. Ancient Greece wasn't much better. In classical Athens, the birthplace of democracy, they keep reminding us, women had essentially no legal personhood at all. A historian noted that by the end of the archaic era, women had lost their legal and societal personhood and were becoming almost invisible. No voting, no owning property, no appearing in court without a male guardian speaking for them. And Athens is the civilization we credit with inventing democracy. For men, just for men. Rome, where women could almost breathe. Here's a surprising one. Ancient Rome gave women slightly more room than Greece. Roman women could own property, run businesses, and in some cases had genuine legal rights. Historians have called this relatively progressive for its time. But, and it's a big but, adultery laws were still catastrophically one-sided. Under Emperor Constantine, adultery by a woman was punishable by death. A man doing the same thing? Different story. And a woman condemned for adultery was permanently banned from remarrying. She was punished for life for the exact same behavior her husband could walk away from. And fashion? Don't even get started. Roman law banned women from wearing certain clothes, jewelry or ornaments, anything reserved for the emperor and his family. You could be fined for dressing above your station. Your wardrobe was literally regulated by the government. The Middle Ages, when things got dark. If you thought Rome was rough, the Middle Ages decided to hold its beer. Under English common law, which developed from the 12th century onward, something called coverture became the law of the land. Here's what coverture meant in plain English. When a woman got married, she legally ceased to exist as a separate person. Her identity merged entirely into her husband's. She couldn't own property. She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't sue anyone or be sued. She couldn't keep her own wages. Everything she had, everything she earned, everything she inherited, all of it legally became his the moment she said, I do. Imagine working your whole life building something, and then one ceremony later, the law says it's not yours anymore. That was just Tuesday for centuries. And if her husband decided to beat her, also legal. The only rule was that he couldn't kill her or beat her so severely that it disturbed public peace. That was the limit. Don't make a scene. The beating itself was fine. Scotland had a taste on women's marriages called mercheta mulieris. Basically, when a tenant's daughter got married, the lord of the land got paid. Women's marriages were a revenue stream, not just for their families, for their feudal overlords. And in Scotland, a female brewer who made bad ale, fined and publicly humiliated on something called a cucking stool, a chair used to publicly shame people by dunking them in water or exposing them to ridicule. Because bad ale, that was the crime. Witch trials, the most deadly chapter. Now here's where it gets truly horrifying, and we need to talk about it. Between the 1300s and the late 1700s, Europe went through what historians call the Great Witch Craze. The numbers are genuinely hard to process. An estimated 100,000 people were put on trial for witchcraft. Between 40,000 and 60,000 were executed. And more than three-quarters of all those accused? Women. Think about that. Tens of thousands of women killed for witchcraft. But what actually got you accused of witchcraft? Being old, being poor, knowing herbal remedies, living alone, arguing with a neighbor, being too outspoken, having a mole or a birthmark in the wrong place. In some towns, the accusations spread like wildfire because once someone confessed, often under torture, they were pressured to name others. A handbook called the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486 and used by witch hunters across Europe, actually stated in writing that women were more susceptible to witchcraft because of their, quote, feeble minds and carnal natures. It said, and this is real, when a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. That book became a bestseller. It was used as a legal guide for executing women for centuries. The Salem witch trials in 1692 are probably the most famous version of this in American history. More than 200 people were accused. 30 were convicted. 19 were executed by hanging, 14 of them women. One man was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. 5 more people died in jail while awaiting trial. And here's a detail that gets overlooked. The accusing parties were mostly teenage girls. Some of them later admitted they had made the whole thing up. By then, 19 people were already dead. Massachusetts didn't formally apologize until 1957. That's not ancient history. That's 2 years after James Dean died. The medieval church. Bonus crimes. While we're in the Middle Ages, let's talk about what the church added to the list. Second marriages for widows? Frowned upon. Third marriages? Valid, but you'd be fined and subject to church law penalties. The message was clear. A woman's romantic life was subject to approval, regulation, and punishment from the moment she was born to the moment she died. And reading? A big fear about women learning to read was, and this is a real historical quote, that it was something they could do alone without anyone to guide their thinking. They would learn to think independently. The horror. For most of the first 1,000 years of written history, women were barred from reading entirely. The ban wasn't casual, it was deliberate, because an educated woman was a dangerous woman. She might form her own opinions. She might disagree. She might write things down. 1800s America. You'd think we'd have figured it out by now. Here's where it gets close to home. In the United States in the 1800s, coverture, remember the medieval law that erased women's legal identity upon marriage, was still very much in effect. When a woman married, she lost the right to own property, control her own finances, sign legal documents, or even keep her own wages. Her husband owned her earnings, legally. The first state to even give married women the right to hold property in their own name was Mississippi in 1839. And even then, it required the husband's permission. That's not ancient Rome, that's 1839. And if you think owning property was wild, try voting. In 1777, all states had passed laws stripping women of the right to vote, not refusing to grant it, actively taking it away from women who'd had it in some places. And it stayed that way for over 140 years. But here's a story that captures the whole era perfectly. In 1872, a woman named Susan B. Anthony walked into a voter registration office in Rochester, New York, and demanded to be registered to vote. The officials hesitated. She quoted the 14th Amendment at them, the part that says no state can deny any citizen their rights. She threatened to sue them personally if they refused. They caved. She voted. 2 weeks later, a deputy federal marshal showed up at her door to arrest her. She was charged with knowingly, wrongfully, and unlawfully voting. Her crime, casting a ballot. At her trial, the judge literally instructed the jury to find her guilty without deliberating, no discussion. Guilty. She was fined $100. She never paid it. She died in 1906, 14 years before American women were legally allowed to vote. She never saw it. The pants problem. Here's one that sounds like a joke, but absolutely is not. In 1800, Paris made it illegal for women to wear trousers. Not just frowned upon, illegal. Women who wanted to dress as men, meaning wear pants, had to obtain special written permission from the police. The law was amended in 1892 and 1909 to allow women to wear trousers in two specific situations, while holding bicycle handlebars or while holding the reins of a horse. That was it. Those were the exceptions. The famous French painter Rosa Bonheur had to apply to the police for a special permit just to wear pants while sketching at cattle markets. The novelist George Sand just wore pants without a permit, which made her a celebrated rebel and a national scandal simultaneously. In 1938 America, a teacher named Helen Hulick showed up to court to testify as a witness, in pants. The judge ordered her to go home and change. She refused. He sent her to jail for 5 days for wearing pants, to court, as a witness, not even as the defendant. In 1978 in France, a female member of parliament showed up to the National Assembly building wearing pants and was refused entry. Eventually, they let her in, but it happened. And here's the kicker. The Paris trouser ban was not officially repealed until January 31st, 2013. You read that right, 2013. The same year the iPhone 5S came out, the law had stopped being enforced decades earlier, but it sat on the books, valid and uncontested, for over 200 years. The professions. You can't do that job, no property, no vote, no pants, and also no career. In 1873, a woman named Myra Bradwell passed the Illinois bar exam and applied for a license to practice law. The Illinois State Bar refused her. She took it to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against her. The official reason? God and nature intended women for the domestic sphere, not for the occupations of civil life. That was the Supreme Court. In 1873, official ruling. Harvard Law School didn't admit women until 1950. 1950, not 1850, not 1750, 1950. And it wasn't a passive thing either. Historians describe the resistance to women in law not as a failure to welcome them with open arms, but as an active effort to keep them out. When women finally got into law schools, they were sometimes only called on during ladies' days, special days reserved for discussing sexual assault cases or reading poetry aloud, because apparently that's what women were good for. In medicine, it was only slightly better. Elizabeth Blackwell became the first woman to earn a medical degree in the United States in 1849. She got in partly because the all-male student body thought her application was a prank and voted yes as a joke. She graduated top of her class. They weren't laughing anymore. The 20th century, still not done. You'd think by the 1900s things would be mostly sorted. They were not. In 1907, Japan revised its criminal law to make abortion punishable by up to 1 year in prison for women who had one. Practitioners could get 7 years. That law was technically still in effect at the time of writing, overridden by other legislation but never repealed. In 1924 in New York, a law was upheld that banned waitresses from working the night shift. Not waiters, waitresses. Women were legally banned from working certain hours of the day. In the United States, married women couldn't legally open their own bank account without their husband's permission until the 1960s. Couldn't get their own credit card in their own name until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974. Not ancient Rome, 1974. In 1961, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that laws effectively excluding women from jury pools were not discrimination. They called it an inoffensive accommodation of women's special responsibilities. Translation, stay home, we'll handle it. Women weren't allowed to wear pants on the floor of the U.S. Senate until 1993. Let that one breathe. The world today. It's not over. Here's the part where this stops being history. As of recent years, there are still countries where women cannot leave the house without a male guardian's permission. Cannot drive, cannot open a bank account independently, cannot choose who they marry. In some places, marital rape was not classified as a crime until the 1990s. And in several countries, it still isn't. England and Wales only criminalized marital rape in 1991. The United States didn't have a federal law recognizing it as a crime in all 50 states until 1993. The last known execution for witchcraft in Switzerland was in 1782, not the 1400s, 1782. And isolated accusations and witch killings in parts of Africa, South Asia, and Papua New Guinea have continued into the modern era. Some things have changed dramatically. Women have led countries, commanded armies, won Nobel Prizes, run companies, walked in space, and written the books that changed the world. Elizabeth Blackwell, the woman who got into medical school as a joke, graduated at the top of her class and eventually co-founded the first medical college for women in the United States. Susan B. Anthony, who was fined for the crime of voting, had her face put on a dollar coin. Her fine was symbolically pardoned 148 years later. Myra Bradwell, who was denied a law license by the Supreme Court, was eventually admitted to the Illinois bar in 1890. She was 54 years old. The numbers, here's the wild recap. Women were legally barred from owning property in most of the U.S. until the mid-1800s. They couldn't vote until 1920. They couldn't practice law by Supreme Court ruling until after 1873. They couldn't wear pants in Paris without police permission until 2013. They couldn't get their own credit card in the U.S. until 1974. And they were being executed for witchcraft in the tens of thousands between the 1300s and the 1700s. Three-quarters of everyone who was ever accused of witchcraft in European history was a woman, 75%. Not because women were actually witches, but because being a woman in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with too much knowledge or too much confidence, was enough. Here's the most insane part of all of this. At almost every step of this history, the women fought back. They petitioned, they marched, they published. They walked into courtrooms they weren't supposed to enter, wore clothes they weren't supposed to wear, cast votes they weren't supposed to own, and practiced professions they were legally barred from. And slowly, stubbornly, one ridiculous law at a time, they won. But if you think the story ends there, well, we'll save that for another video.